Okay, so we are looking at PFT 105 today. So this is going to be the start of our exercise physiology class, right? So PFT 105 or exercise physiology, this is going to be a little bit different. For those of you who have taken anatomy and physiology, this is going to be a little bit different than that. This will have a little bit less anatomy, and this is going to focus more on like how things work. And we're going to talk a lot about ATP production once we get to it. So you'll notice we're really covering a lot of like functional stuff in this course. Take a look here. You can see the first day we're going to get into a little bit of cellular metabolism. So we're going to talk a little bit about like cellular biology here in the beginning. Followed by tomorrow, we're going to get into digestive physiology. So we're going to talk about like how we actually break down and extract nutrients. This stuff will look really familiar again in our next class, which will be nutrition. So we are in the middle of the quote unquote weight loss mod. We are going to have our 12-day class right now, which is exercise physiology. Then we're going to be moving into our 8-day class, which is nutrition 1. Then we're going to move into our 10-day program design class, which will be program design weight loss. And that is based around NASM's WLS certification, which is their weight loss specialist certification. Again, that's not one that you're going to get when you graduate. That's not one of the certifications that you've purchased as part of like your Sochi program, but it is part of your knowledge base, which is pretty cool. So keep your notes, and in a couple of years, if you want to get that certification, you got everything you need to pass it. So, so you can see there's going to be some parallels here. A lot of what we're talking about in this class is going to show up again in the next class because we really want you to know the parts, the moving parts of your digestive system and how nutrition works and things like that. Then we're going to get into respiratory physiology, so we'll dive into the lungs a little bit. We'll get cardiovascular physiology, where we'll dive into the heart a little bit, and then we'll get neuromuscular physiology, where we'll dive into our muscles and nervous system. Then we're going to have our midterm. So this is a 12-day class. There will be homework on days 2 and days 4, followed by a midterm on day 6. Then it will be homework on days 3 and day 10, with a final exam on day 12. So classic 12-day formats that some of you are used to. For those of you who are brand new to Sochi, this will be kind of the first time you've seen this stuff. But that is how we're going to kind of work our way through those things. Then you'll notice that on the second half of this class, we are really diving in really hard on ATP production. So we're going to talk about exercise metabolism, you know, the difference between training your aerobic system and your anaerobic systems. That's the difference between strength and cardio, basically. Then we're going to look at actually training the anaerobic system, training the muscular system, because those two very much go hand in hand. Then we'll talk about training the aerobic system and wrap everything up with a little bit of nutrition at the end, which will kind of move us right into our actual nutrition mod. So we'll talk about like which nutrients are best for providing you with the energy to do all these other 3 systems that we talked about. So this class is very much going to cover a lot of like how our bodies work. We're going to do a foundational part of that first, where we really dive into the how of, you know, cells. Then we'll dive into the how of food, and then we'll dive into the how of, you know, lungs, heart, and muscles, which are kind of the 3 big things that we as trainers sort of work on. Then after that, we are going to get into the really nitty-gritty specifics of like how to train for those things specifically. So very much some knowledge base, very much some practical application. And that is kind of our PFT 105 in a nutshell. So let's go ahead and open up this first PowerPoint here. All right, what am I doing? I totally just dove right back into like regular Sochi land. I was about to project that to my second screen on the TV, and I don't have a second screen or a TV. I have a Zoom call. All right, put that there. So we are looking at, this is, like I said, PFT 105, which is exercise physiology. We are on day 1 here, PowerPoint 1, which is going to be cellular metabolism. So we're breaking a little bit down of like breaking a little bit of like cellular biology down. Pull that, open this up to 70%. With bullet points. Okay, so today when we're talking about this, I want to kind of describe the real basics of like what metabolism is, understanding the differences between catabolism and anabolism, or catabolism and anabolism. You can say it however you want. We're also going to describe a little bit about like what takes place in what's called an oxidation reduction reaction, which is always really fun to say. We'll explain the basics of cellular respiration, which we will be getting much more in depth into like later on when we talk about energy production. And then we'll talk a little bit about like the difference of glycogenesis, gluconeogenesis, and lipolysis, which is basically the production of glycogen, breaking down amino acids to produce ATP when it has to, and the production of using fat as for metabolism. We will also briefly discuss how hydrolysis works, and that is really one of the big things we want to get into today. Really understanding the difference between like hydrolysis and what is called dehydration synthesis, which is what we're seeing. I forgot there's 2 slides of learning objectives in this one. It's like, oh my God, that's long. So glycolysis, fatty acids, amino acids, our metabolic pathways, and how oxidation works. So big things I'm really concerned of is I want everybody to understand like how molecules split and combine together. That's really kind of my main focus today. If we understand that, it'll help us understand everything that happens in the rest of this. So obviously, everything in our body is a series of like chemical reactions, right? And that's what metabolism actually is defined as. Like a lot of people think when they hear like the word metabolism, they're like, oh, that's how many calories you burn every day. I have a slow metabolism, you know, like, or I have a fast metabolism. That's certainly related to the concept of metabolism. Like that's definitely like a metabolic thing, but it's not what metabolism is, right? Metabolism is actually all chemical, any and all chemical reactions that are taking place within your body. And we're going to see that definition here in just a second. But that, if we understand that that is metabolism, like how efficiently your body splits molecules or creates molecules, like that is really what metabolism is actually all about. So we want to understand those chemical reactions. And then we need to understand that, like, you know, what a molecule is it's a series of like atoms coming together, a series of elements kind of all being like formed up in kind of an interesting shape and an interesting design. And when there's a lot of energy trapped within that molecule. And so when you break something off from that, that energy is released. And we can use that to do a lot of different things. That's how we take something as complex as a piece of broccoli and break it down into simple sugars in the end. At the end of the day, broccoli and white table sugar actually end up looking exactly the same once pieces of them are all broken down. Now, obviously, broccoli has way more nutrients in it. It has very different effects on the body. But at the end of the day, like it is actually just a very complex carbohydrate versus sugar, which is a very simple carbohydrate. So one of them is already broken down and one of them is very, very complicated. So luckily, we have this amazing unassembly line, like, you know, the opposite of an assembly line, I guess a disassembly line, called your digestive system that's really good at breaking that stuff down so that we can extract those nutrients. So as our cells divide, obviously, you know, they're going to build things up as well. You know, like we have to use all that energy that we just broke down, and then we need to rebuild it back up into something that is like us shaped, you know? And that's where we have to talk a little bit about like enzymes and how metabolic reactions work. So first, let's go ahead and define metabolism, right? So metabolism is going to be defined as any and all chemical reactions that take place within the body, okay? So metabolism is anything chemical, right? If a chemical change takes place somewhere inside of like a cell, that's part of your metabolism. So obviously, like growth is a part of that. Releasing waste products is a part of that. Digesting nutrients is a big part of that. And so, like when you hear somebody say like they have a fast metabolism or a slow metabolism, which is why they either get hungry very often or not, right? Yeah, that is like somewhat related. Like your hunger doesn't have it's a small part of your metabolism, a very, 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 very small part. And it's determined by a lot of like your metabolism, but it's not what your metabolism actually is. A lot of people have a very basic understanding of what they think metabolism means. We need to have a much more complex look at that because the two versions of metabolism that we need to concern ourselves with are anabolism and catabolism. So these are the two main versions. So of your metabolic reactions, we're trying to boil this down into twos. It's always really helpful whenever you're studying biology to break stuff down into twos. You have yes, you have no, you have zero, you have one. It is or it isn't. Try to get it down to twos, and it can't be. It's like, well, what about? Nope. Yes or no. We want to boil it down. We want to keep it as simple as possible. So there are only two types of chemical reactions. There are chemical reactions that are building something up, and there's chemical reactions that are breaking something down. Okay. So as we're studying this, we want to think of these two things. So let's look at anabolism first, or anabolism, right? Anabolism, right? This is going to be the bonding of smaller molecules to form larger molecules. Okay, you can think of this as it is a building up reaction, right? Actually, you know what? Let's do this instead. Let's say that's the in parentheses part or in quotations part. Because that's what this is. It's a building up reaction, right? Anabolic reactions build something. So let's say you walk into like a buffet and go nuts, right? Like maybe you had like a really hard workout, or maybe it's just been a few hours since you ate something, and so you're like really starving, and you're like, great, there's a buffet. You go over there and you go to town. You get pancakes and sausage and bacon and more bacon, like you're going nuts on that buffet. That's great and all, but here's what's going to happen. You just took all this food, right, which is a ton of energy trapped within it. There's a lot of like stuff in that food, and it's a lot of stuff that like our body can use, right, which is a good thing. So it's a good thing to bring in food. We want to replace anything so we can continue using it for energy, but because it's a buffet, probably not watching your portions, probably not really paying too much attention to like how much of something you're bringing in, going crazy. So now if all of that food gets into your body, now it is all stuck in your body. And so a lot of that food is going to be used to like create energy. In fact, all of it is trapped energy. So, for the most part, your body's going to break that down, and you're going to get like super amped up. You're like, you're probably going to feel a little lethargic like right after the meal, but like, it's like Thanksgiving, when everybody like has like Thanksgiving dinner, and then everybody's just like chilling on the couch like, oh, it hurts, get a little sleepy maybe. But then you rally and you have all that energy afterwards, right? That's what's going to happen. A lot of that food's going to be broken down for energy to give you, so you can do like a lot of work. But you brought in so much energy that your body is now going to take all of that, and it has to do something with it, right? Like the energy is inside your body. There's no way to get rid of it now unless it can convert it and build it up into a new molecule that you can store and hold on to that energy to maybe be used for later. So what will happen is your body will actually convert a lot of that energy into molecules of fat, and it will store it wherever it can store it on your body. And that's sort of how like weight gain really works. Your body gets an excess of energy compared to how much energy you're burning, and that results in like your body going, all right, well, I have to put this energy somewhere. So it turns it into a molecule of fat and stores it somewhere. And that's what's really cool about fat cells. They're really unique cells. They have this big empty shell around the outside of them where they can store fatty acids. And so your body can convert things into fatty acids, and there you go. You can store all that energy. Some of it got broken down for you to like do work, and some of it got stored as like a short-term energy for you to use later. But a good chunk of it got stored as like fat molecules. So that is very much an anabolic reaction. But in order to get there, we had to take that bacon and break it down. We had to take those pancakes and break them down, right? And that type of reaction is what's referred to as a catabolic reaction. So catabolism is going to be the breaking down of complex molecules to form smaller molecules. So if you took something that's really large and really complex and you snapped it off and broke it down, that's a catabolic reaction, right? Taking something that is very big and breaking it into something very small. That's a breaking down reaction. That's what you can think of as catabolism. So your digestive system is very much a catabolic system, whereas your metabolism that builds like ATP, like your cells and your mitochondria, that is very much like an anabolic system. And so this is really kind of where we're looking at the differences between, you know, building stuff up and breaking stuff down. So we're going to show a little video here that really explains this pretty well. So I got a quick little overview here of metabolism.
Textbooks define metabolism, a topic in biochemistry, as a series of chemical reactions that take place inside of our bodies to sustain life. Now, this is a pretty broad definition of metabolism. So in this video, I really want to break this definition down to a more workable understanding of what metabolism really is. So first, I'm going to introduce another arrow in this diagram like this and say that really the requirements of life, let's say in a human being, such as, you know, maintaining a constant internal temperature, reproducing, growing, and all that jazz, all of that ultimately boils down to the body's ability to utilize 4 essential biomolecules. And these 4 essential biomolecules, or as they're sometimes known as macromolecules, are proteins, fats, carbohydrates or carbs, and nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. And ultimately, all of these biomolecules perform different life-sustaining reactions inside of all of the cells in our body to ultimately promote life. So as you can see, we've already begun to break down this definition of metabolism. Essentially, what we're saying here is that metabolism is really the study of how we're able to obtain these important biomolecules to sustain life. So how do we obtain these biomolecules? Now, the simple answer to this question is, of course, that we eat food to obtain all of these important biomolecules. But there's an important word of caution here, which is that since most food comes from living organisms like plants and animals, these plants and animals also contain an array of proteins, fats, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids, but not necessarily in the same flavor or configuration that our bodies would prefer. So what do our bodies do instead? Well, in our bodies, we go ahead and eat the food. It's a very large head there, but you get the idea. And in our bodies, we break down this food through a process called digestion into the component parts of all of these biomolecules. So what do I mean by component parts? Well, the smallest subunit of proteins is called an amino acid, and our body breaks down all the different types of proteins that we digest into individual amino acids. And the same pattern continues for the rest of the biomolecules. So in the case of fats, we're talking about fatty acids, which are the smallest subunits of fats. And then for carbohydrates, which are long chains of sugars, one of the most common subunits of carbohydrates that our body loves is called glucose. So I'll go ahead and write that here since you'll be seeing it a lot in the discussion of metabolism. And then finally, for nucleic acids, we're talking about nucleotides. So at this point, you're probably thinking, well, okay, I understand that our body can't use the same macromolecules found in food because maybe they're not in the right configuration, but how does breaking them down do anything for us? Now, the key here is to recognize that in our body, there's actually a delicate balance going on between the processes of breaking down molecules, such as in the process of digestion, and then taking these products and building them back up. So essentially, you can see all of these subunits or monomers as Lego pieces that we're essentially reconstructing to build the right configurations of proteins, fats, carbs, and nucleic acids that our body needs. So that's really the key idea here, which is that metabolism is a balance between breaking things down and building them back up in our body so that we can customize, so to say, what type of macromolecules that we create. And just to throw in some vocab words, biochemists call the process of breaking down molecules in our body catabolism, and a similar sounding word called anabolism is used to describe the process of building molecules back up. And the way I kind of like to remember this is looking at the first letter of each of these words. I think of C, I think of cutting molecules up into tiny pieces, so breaking them down. And then for anabolism, A, I think of as like the apex of like a building, for example. So we're building something up. Now, this seems all fine and elegant, but there's one more issue that we need to contend with, which is a consequence of having to balance breaking things down and building them back up. And that is that this process of building molecules back up requires energy, which I'm kind of indicating here by these yellow lightning bolt stars. So the question I want to answer in this last part of the video is, where does this energy come from? Now, the answer to this question is that, well, we also get this energy by eating food. So how does that work? So first, recall that the energy currency of the cell, and I'm going to go ahead and erase this just to give us some more space. The energy currency of our bodies is a molecule called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. And this high energy molecule, as it's often referred to, when it is broken down into ADP, so it loses a phosphate group, it releases usable chemical energy that can fuel energy requiring processes in our body, such as the building up process of anabolism. Now, in order for this process to continue nonstop in our bodies, ADP must be regenerated into ADP, and that is where food comes in. So remember that we digest our food into all of these subunits, and some of these subunits, such as glucose and fatty acids mainly, but occasionally amino acids, so I'm going to put that in parentheses, can essentially be used as fuels in our body. So just like wood, for example, is a fuel for a burning fire, which produces heat, these fuels in our body can essentially be broken down even further to produce the energy that's necessary to convert ADP back into ATP, and thus allowing this cycle to continue. And just to throw in another vocabulary word that you'll probably see, this process of taking these fuels, which I've indicated with this asterisk, and breaking them down into usable energy is a process that's referred to as cellular respiration. And recall that because cellular respiration involves breaking down things even further, it's also a catabolic process. So it falls under this category of catabolism. And just to tie everything here together at the end, notice here that another way to interpret this cycling between ATP and ADP is to say that catabolism fuels anabolism. So what do I mean by this? Well, essentially, catabolism, such as the process of breaking things down and extracting energy through processes of cellular respiration, is coupled with this process of building things back up. And so in essence, one relies on the other. And as you can probably guess, these processes are really tightly regulated in our bodies because obviously you wouldn't want to be breaking down something while you're building something back up. And in fact, just to give you kind of a preview forward, catabolism and anabolism are often regulated, so controlled through the use of hormones. So I'm going to write here that hormones are a form of regulation and tell the body whether it should be in a catabolic or anabolic state.
So that's really a big preview of kind of everything that's going to happen in the rest of this whole course, right? We are going to kind of work our way through understanding metabolism, right? Because the whole process of metabolism, the whole purpose behind it is for us to be able to generate ATP, right? We need to be able to kind of create enough ATP in order for us to be able to do work. So we need to catabolically break stuff down so that we have fuel, and we need to anabolically build stuff up by using that fuel into the different parts of our body in order to sustain life. Let's talk about the process of building complex molecules up. Let's go ahead and talk about anabolic reactions, right? So again, if we're looking at an overview of anabolism, right? Again, this is the process of building complex stuff up, right? It supplies us with the needed cells in that our body has to kind of grow and repair. This is how you make new, this is how you make new U cells. That's very much an anabolic reaction. But a version of that we are going to talk a lot about, like as personal trainers, is managing your glycogen supplies. And so really quickly, just kind of breaking down like what glycogen is, right? Whoops, I clicked off of I moved people around. How do I get that back? Nope, that's not it. Good Lord, how do I? Well, Maggie, you're in charge of teaching now. Man, there's a thing that's usually here. There's supposed to be a thing. Let's go like that and then turn this back up. Nope. Oh my God. Arrow keys, tab. All right, well, Maggie, you might be just who we're staring at in the recording today. What if I pin this video and then screen share? Okay, well, I won't be touching that again. All right, so let's talk about that process of building stuff up, right? So one of the most common things you're going to do is managing a fuel source called glycogen. It's a material, it's basically a very complex carbohydrate. So glycogen is this stuff that you have stored throughout your entire body. It's this liquid, gooey starch that your body is able to store primarily in your liver, but also in all of your muscles. Your muscle tissues have the ability to store this glycogen. And glycogen is, like I said, it's kind of a wet, soupy starch. If you've ever like boiled a pot of potatoes and you've seen that like scum stuff kind of float to the top of like the pot while you're boiling them, those are actually starches leaking out of the potatoes. And because they're not very dense, they kind of sit at the very top of the pot there. And like you can kind of scoop all that stuff off and it's this like liquid. That is actually very much what glycogen looks like inside your body. It's this liquidy, complex carbohydrate, series of starches. And so when you think about like what a carbohydrate is, it's a series of little molecules of glucose. It's a whole bunch of glucose molecules, a whole bunch of sugars, all tied together in these big complex chains. So if you break one of those sugars off, you're left with a single molecule of glucose. The longer the chain is, the more complex it is. And that's even where you get to things like cellulose. Like cellulose is an incredibly complex carbohydrate that we don't even have the ability to break down. Like if you eat, like that's what fiber is. Like if you eat like a bowl of spinach, a lot of that is made up of cellulose. At the end of the day, it's actually all just complex chains of sugars. But we aren't able to really break most of that down. And so it ends up like passing through your digestive system unbroken down and actually pulls some materials out the other end, which is really nice. So if we're talking about like building up glycogen, how does our body, like how do we have a chemical reaction that results in, like, let's say I have two separate sugar molecules, right? Like I ate some carbohydrates and then they went into my digestive system. My digestive system broke it into individual sugars. And now my body wants to store it as glycogen for me to use for energy later, right? Remember we were talking about building up fat to be used for energy later. That's great. But we also have to be able to build up glycogen to be used for energy later, because we need glucose as a fuel source for like intense activity. So how do I like create like a new molecule of glycogen? Well, I'm gonna need to link two sugar molecules together, and then I'm gonna need to link another one and another one and another one until I got this big complex chain of thousands of sugar molecules. So how do I actually do that? Well, I'm going to do that through a process of what is called dehydration synthesis. And so it's a process in which simple sugar molecules are linked to form a chain, making up molecules of glycogen. This is called, like I said, dehydration synthesis. So let's take a look at what dehydration synthesis is. Dehydration synthesis. If you've ever heard the word synthesis before, synthesis means to synthesize something, right? It means to make something, right? So you are making something by dehydrating two molecules. So if you were to suck a little bit of water out of both molecules, those molecules would get attracted to each other and they would link, right? And that's actually what we're seeing in this picture right here. So take a look here. Both of these are actually carbohydrates. This is a sugar molecule and that is a sugar molecule, okay? These are the same molecule right next to each other. And you'll notice these molecules, by the way, all of my day one people, welcome to the PFT program. I know this seems really overwhelming, but trust me, we're gonna break this down many times. And this is probably one of the most technical days in the whole program. All right, so take a look here. You can see these two separate sugar molecules. Now, don't pay too much attention to how this is shaded. This shading here is just meant to show you that like these things exist, right? So at the end of this sugar molecule, there is what is called an OH pairing. So there's a molecule of oxygen attached to a molecule of hydrogen. Here's some carbon. That's where we get the name carbohydrate, right? So this is hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. And there's an OH pairing on this end. On this end, there is an HO pairing. So also hydrogen, also oxygen. For the most part, these two molecules, I mean, they're basically identical. But you'll notice if I got two O's and I've got two H's, if I were to pull one of those H's away and just put it over here, and I were to pull another H away and I were to put it over here, and I were to pull an O away and put it over here, I'm left with two H's and an O, which is a molecule of water. That's H2O. Two H's, two hydrogen molecules, and one oxygen molecule. So if I suck those three if I suck those three atoms out of there and put them over here and form like a molecule of water, now what's going to happen is these two separate sugar molecules, they're going to be attracted to each other and they're going to link, and they're going to be held together with that remaining oxygen molecule that we left behind. So now I have this right here, which is a two sugar molecule. So I dehydrated a little bit from each of these molecules, and that linked them together to create one much larger molecule. Now take a look over here. You can see here's another OH pairing, right? I could have another sugar right over here on this side, and I could suck a little bit of water out of there and be left with a little more water. And then another sugar molecule would link to this, and then another one, and another one, and another one, until eventually I have this big complex chain of sugars. And what's really cool about that is I can store that, like I said, in my liver or in any muscle in my body. So now I've got this great, it's like having one of those gel packs that you carry with you during like a marathon, you know, on your body. You've got this stored version of carbohydrates that you're like in the middle of like doing activity, and you can be like, boom, sugar, I got energy, let's do this, right? And that's a very much anabolic reaction. Do you guys have any questions about that? How are you feeling about that so far? Questions, comments, concerns? Nope. All right. So let's put a definition down here for dehydration synthesis. So it is the process of building up molecules by dehydrating two separate simple molecules. The process of building up complex molecules. Process of building up complex molecules by dehydrating two separate simple molecules, okay? That is dehydration synthesis. So we take two things, we make them a little less complicated each. We're left with a little bit of water left over, and now we've got this big complicated molecule. So we can do this in proteins as well. Like this is kind of the classic example that we often use, mostly because carbohydrates are just easier to draw. But we can also do this in proteins. Like one of the ways that your body makes new muscle tissue is by building up individual molecules into more advanced proteins, right? And so you can do that like this version here. Notice how these are two separate amino acids, right? This is an amino acid over here, so that is like something that you would get from eating like a protein. So let's say you ate like a piece of chicken, right? That piece of chicken is made up of a lot of protein, and in that protein, proteins are made up of what are called amino acids. So all of those amino acids are going to get broken down into individual little tiny pieces. So now you've got a whole bunch of little tiny amino acids. So here's one right here, and here's one right here. And what's going to happen, you'll notice, right, this guy ends in an OH pairing, and this guy over here ends in a hydrogen pairing. So what's going to happen is you're going to pull the H out, you're going to pull the H out, you're going to pull the O out, you're left with a molecule of water. You dehydrated a little bit from here and a little bit from here. Now these two molecules are going to link together. They're going to be held together with this little bit of nitrogen in the middle here. And so now you're holding the whole thing together. You've got a slightly more complex protein. This is an amino acid, this is an amino acid, but then you dehydrated them and now you have a protein. So that's all great, right? That's how we perform. Oh no, I closed the whole thing. That is how we perform, protein synthesis. That's how we make new proteins within our body. Now we've also got. I'm actually not sure. We're at metabolism. Sorry for those of you who are taking notes along the way. I'm realizing I didn't come up with a very good section header. So that's an overview of metabolic processes. Now let's look at the other direction. Let's go catabolic. Let's break stuff down. How do we take, how do I take that chicken breast and break it up into individual little amino acids, right? That's the process of digestion. I take something that's very complex and I split it up into individual little simple parts. In the video, she was using the analogy of like Lego blocks. That's a great analogy. If I've got like this big complicated Lego structure and I need to break it down into individual pieces so that I can build some other new Lego structure up afterwards, right? I'm gonna take a chicken breast, and I'm gonna break it down into amino acids, and my body is then gonna build it back up into something new, right? And that is gonna be done through the process. That's an anabolic process, building it back up, but it's a catabolic process when I'm breaking it down. How do I break it down? Well, the opposite of dehydration synthesis is what is called hydrolysis. And hydrolysis involves the decomposition of molecules such as carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins by splitting the molecules with water. So if before I took some hydrogen out, I took some hydrogen out, and I took some oxygen out, and I dehydrated, well, that linked those things together. Hydrolysis is how I'm going to use water to break the molecules apart. So it's literally the exact opposite process. Do I get a picture? No, I don't, of course not. So I'm going to go back and use this picture here. So let's imagine this picture here. This says anabolism, and this very much is, right? I'm pulling water out to link molecules. Let's go backwards. Let's say I've got a linked molecule here, right? And I shove one of the H's from my water molecule, and I shove it in between right here, right? That's going to break this molecule apart. And then I take the other H that I have and I use it to close off this molecule right over here. And I take the other oxygen that I have and I use it to close off this molecule over here. If I shove that water molecule in between this linked molecule here, it will break apart and I will be left with a molecule of glucose over here, and I'll be left with a molecule of glucose over here. That is actually how the process of digestion works. This is why water is the most important nutrient that you need to eat every single day, because you cannot have metabolism without water. You need water in order to be able to catabolically break stuff down. And you have to be able to catabolically break stuff down in order to be able to anabolically build stuff up. Does that make sense, everybody? How are we doing so far? Are we tracking well? Maggie, you still with us?
Yeah, good. Everything's
Okay.
good. Yeah.
Awesome. I can't, normally I like to check in on your faces, but I can't right now. I don't know what's going on with Zoom. I don't know if they updated the freaking thing, but they took away my button that lets me check faces. So, all right, now, how do we actually control all these reactions, right? How do we actually like kind of break this stuff down and control it? Well, obviously, like, you know, we have a lot of different cells within our body that kind of help that happen. You know, you've got nerve cells, muscle cells, blood cells. All those are specialized to carry out different chemical reactions, right? Like blood cells, they're really good at like carrying oxygen around the body to create like oxygen, you know, reactions. Muscle cells rely on that oxygen, but they're also really good at like producing ATP. So all of your cells have different chemical reactions that are really important. But how do they actually know how to kick stuff off? Like, how does your cell know that it's time to like, oh, I should, you know, there's some glucose over there. I'm going to go ahead and dehydrate that sucker, you know, so I can break it down. How does your body like know how to do all that stuff? Well, it has these really cool little proteins that are called enzymes. So enzymes are actually an example of protein. So your body actually makes its own enzymes. So enzymes are proteins that coordinate chemical changes in order to control metabolic reactions. So enzymes are really cool. Enzymes actually kick off chemical reactions, right? Whoops, that's not what I meant. Enzymes kick off chemical reactions, right? Here's how I like to think of it. It works like a lock and key mechanism. So here's how I always like to think about enzymes. Like, you've got gasoline in your car, right? Like, cars run on regular old gasoline, right? That's the fuel that allows them to like do work, right? But you can't unlock that ability to do work unless you take your key and stick it in the ignition and turn it. That key unlocks your car's ability to use gasoline as a fuel source. That's kind of like how an enzyme works. Enzymes don't have any energy of their own, but they kick off chemical reactions. So how does your body know to use a little bit of a water molecule to bust stuff up? Well, an enzyme might kick off that chemical reaction and tell it to occur. How does your body know how to split up a molecule of fat? Same process. How does your body know how to build something up? Same process. When we look at metabolism, and some of our students, we've talked briefly about the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle has all these little tiny chemical reactions that are taking place within it. All of those are taking place because of what are called, they call them coenzymes because they're like, I don't know, they're little miniature enzymes and they also kind of rely on each other. But we can just think of them as enzymes. And where do you actually get those enzymes from? Well, they're actually in the form of B vitamins. That's why B vitamins are such a necessary part of our diet. They don't have any energy of their own, right? Like, B vitamins have no calories. They're completely energy free. So when somebody says like, you got to get your B vitamins, they give you energy. That's not necessarily wrong, and we're not going to make fun of that person. But technically, B vitamins don't have any energy of their own. Technically, they just allow your body to use energy that you ate from like carbohydrates and things like that. But good luck trying to explain that. You don't want to be that person. So at the end of the day, you know, the reason we're talking about this stuff is because we are trying to, you know, come up with enough chemical energy to get us through the activities of everyday life. And so the ability to do work comes from our ability to extract and create energy. That's where our metabolic processes come from. So we're going to store energy within our body, and we're going to do it in a, because energy, here's the thing about energy. Once it's there, it's really unstable, and you know, it heats things up and it moves things around. And so we can't just have like passive energy stored in our body. So we need to be able to store something else that has a lot of energy within it. And that's where the molecule of ATP comes in. So basically, we will store molecules of ATP which have a lot of energy trapped within them, and then we'll break that molecule of ATP and release all that energy. Then our body captures that energy and it does a whole bunch of work. So chemical energy release happens when the bonds between atoms are broken. And you can think of this like if you've ever, you know, if you remember like watching any sci-fi movie or action movie, even, and it's like talking about like nuclear bombs, right? Like what that is, it's like it's an atom bomb, you know, like a nuke is basically like this special type of like missile thing that basically splits an atom. And when that happens, a ton of energy is released. Like atoms are the smallest thing in the universe. They're one piece. They're not really meant to be broken up into individual pieces. Now molecules, which are much larger, they're made up of like a lot of atoms. So we can break those down and release little bits of energy. But anytime you break something, energy is going to get released. Think about like the last time you broke a stick and it was just really loud, right? That was still energy being released. An atom bomb is splitting like the thing that was never meant to be split. That's also how nuclear power plants work. You know, we basically take molecules and we split them, I'm sorry, not molecules. We take atoms and we split them, and a whole bunch of energy is released, and we capture that to power our cities. So we store our energy in the bonds between these molecules. And so whenever you break the bonds between molecules, a whole bunch of energy is released. It's usually in the form of heat, but it can sometimes be in the form of light. That's why, you know, atom bombs are super bright. And so like the most classic example of this inside of our bodies, we'll stop talking about bombs now. The classic example of this is during like an oxidation environment where we break down molecules of glucose to produce ATP molecules. So we're going to break down sugar molecules to produce ATP. So a sugar molecule, right, that carbohydrate that we were looking at earlier, you know, this guy right here, that's a single carbohydrate molecule. That is a molecule of glucose. We're going to break all these individual little bonds, and that's going to result in a whole bunch of ATP. So we're going to break those, take that ATP molecule. Now, when that energy is released, we're going to capture it in order to be able to actually do work. And so enzymes are in charge of like kicking that chemical reaction off, and they can help us do that. So the process by which we're going to do this requires kind of these three main processes that I'm going to break down very simply right now, but we're going to call this cellular respiration. This is basically the process of how your cells breathe. Can we not? What are you? Oh, it's going down a page. Oh my God. I was like, what is going on here? I just lost my millennial card. So this is going to be the process of what we call cellular respiration. And this is going to describe how our cells take in nutrients and put out energy. Okay, so it describes how our cells like take in nutrients such as oxygen and glucose and things like that and spit out those ATP molecules. So there's three main processes here. The first one is going to be called glycolysis. And glycolysis is what we call an anabolic reaction. This is an anabolic reaction. Meaning that it takes place without oxygen, Okay? It's a without oxygen reaction used to produce ATP in the fluid portion of a cell. So it's a good thing that it takes place during, without the use of oxygen, because it's doing it in the liquid portion of a cell where, there really isn't any oxygen. That's the first part of metabolism. The next part that's going to happen is going to be what's called the citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle, named after the guy who discovered it. And so the citric acid cycle, or more commonly called the Krebs cycle, is going to be an aerobic reaction, meaning it takes place, it is a with oxygen reaction, is used to produce ATP in the mitochondria. Okay, and so the citric acid cycle basically goes through this whole process of taking the byproducts of glycolysis and further breaking those things down into more ATP molecules. Then it has its own byproducts as well, which are then going to go through what is called the electron transport chain, and this is going to be another aerobic process used to produce ATP in the mitochondria, and it that uses the byproducts of the other parts of metabolism. So basically, you're going to do glycolysis first. That's going to produce a little bit of ATP and some lactic acid. Then that lactic acid is going to be used to produce more ATP with some oxygen's help in the citric acid cycle. And then the byproducts of that are going to further go into the electron transport chain with even more oxygen and produce even greater molecules of ATP. So that is cellular respiration in a nutshell. I've got another really quick video that is going to kind of break this down. We're not going to watch this whole thing. I'm just going to skip to the parts that are
Hi, it's Mr. Anderson.
relevant.
In this podcast, I'm going to talk about cellular respiration. Sometimes students confuse
Actually,
respiration,
the first part of this is really
breathing, just breathing in, and cellular respiration, and they are linked. Cellular respiration, however, is going to take place at the level of a cell, more specifically inside the mitochondria. And so we need oxygen for that. But it's basically taking our food and then breaking it down in the presence of oxygen to make ATP out of it. What if you're a bacteria? Can you do respiration? You sure can. You don't need a mitochondria to do respiration. They can actually use their outer membranes to do aerobic respiration. And so basically, if you are a track athlete, so this is Usain Bolt right here, when you run, you're using respiration to make energy in the form of ATP and allow your muscles to move. And so this is a quick little study I did. I took all of the world records currently right now from the 100 to the 10,000. And so this is Bekele is the guy who owns the 10,000 meter record. And what I did is I figured out their pace. In other words, how fast they're running. This would be in meters per second for the 100, the 200, all the way down to the 10,000 meter run, which is a little over 6 miles. And what you can see in this graph is that the pace is quickly going to drop off, and then it's pretty much going to stabilize. And if we were to go out to the marathon or continue, basically, we're pretty effective at running at a specific pace. But we die really quickly when we're sprinting. And so a way to think about that is the two things we're going to talk about in this podcast is we're going to talk about aerobic respiration. So aerobic respiration is going to be respiration in the presence of oxygen. But we also have almost like a turbo button that is anaerobic respiration. And so if we really need to go fast, we can get that extra speed that we have up here by doing our anaerobic respiration. The problem, if you've ever run, is that when you get out to this 400 meter, you get a buildup of lactic acid, and it's incredibly painful. So you can't keep that pace going. Example of a lab I did in class was, and it's weird how this exactly mirrors it, what we did was the muscle fatigue lab. So basically you had a tennis ball, and in one hand you had to squeeze it as many times as you could in 10 seconds, and then do another 10 seconds, and do another 10 seconds. And this is the class average. So the class average was, it looks like around 25 times in 10 seconds. But you can see that it quickly drops off, and then it kind of levels off. And so the same thing, this would be that aerobic respiration, and then this is going to be that anaerobic And it was fun to see the students' faces, because as they start to go anaerobic, your arm just starts to build up the lactic acid on the inside of it. But before we get there, let's talk about respiration and what it's for. It's for heterotrophs. So we're heterotrophs, and basically what we're doing is we're taking organic compounds in the presence of oxygen, and we're converting that to carbon dioxide and water. What else are we generating? ATP. Now, what kind of things are doing this? Animals, fungi, bacteria are all heterotrophs, and they're using the organic material to actually make energy. Luckily, we have autotrophs like plants and algae, and basically what they're doing is they're converting that carbon dioxide and water back into organic materials. The only thing that's a little deceptive is that plants are also going to break down those organic compounds, and so they do cellular respiration as well. And so everything's doing cellular respiration. It's how we get energy out of our food. Okay, here's our equation. And again, if you know what photosynthesis is, this is simply the opposite. We're going to take glucose in the presence of oxygen. So here's glucose and here's O2. And then we're going to break that into carbon dioxide, water, and then we're going to generate a little bit of ATP. Now, where is the energy sit? The energy sits right here in this hydrogen on the outside of that glucose. And watch what happens to that hydrogen. It's going to fall down and it's going to grab onto the oxygen, because oxygen wants electrons. And so that's where the energy is coming from. What the energy is used to do is it's used to make ATP. And ATP is that little fuel that we use in all of our cells. This slide is funny, but it's saying this: behold the power of oxygen. So this fire comes from oxygen pulling electrons close to it. And so there's a huge amount of energy found inside that pull of electrons towards oxygen. Now, if we were to do this inside our body, we could get a lot of energy out of our food, but we would also burst into flames. And so we do it in a really controlled process. Just like when we learned photosynthesis and we had to learn the parts of the chloroplast, when you're learning the cellular respiration, you have to learn a few parts of the mitochondria. So first of all, we have these folds on the inside of the mitochondria. Those are called the cristae. And basically what we have is two membranes. We're going to have an inner membrane right here, and then we're going to have an outer membrane right here. And then this space in the middle is called the inner membrane space. And on the inside, mitochondria, we think, used to be bacteria of their own. And so they'll reproduce through binary fission. They have their own DNA. They have their ribosomes. But they are kind of almost living inside us, not as a parasite, but as a symbiont. They're actually helping us as we generate energy. So there are 3 steps in cellular respiration. Let's start with the first one. So the first one is going to be glycolysis. The second one normally we think of as the Krebs cycle. And then the third one is going to be the electron transport chain. And so the first one, and I love this diagram here because it's putting glycolysis outside the mitochondria. And so this is going to take place outside the mitochondria. Where would that be? Well, that would be in the cytoplasm of a cell inside your body, or it would be right outside of bacteria. But what happens in glycolysis? Basically, we're taking glucose. Glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. And in glycolysis, we're going to break that down into 2 molecules of pyruvate. Each of those have 3 carbons inside it. So the 2 3-carbon molecule, that's what glycolysis does. What do we generate in there? Well, we generate a little bit of ATP. For 1 glucose molecule in glycolysis, we're going to make 2 ATP. The other thing that we make is a chemical called NAD. What we're basically doing is we're transferring high energy electrons to NAD, and we're adding protons to it as well. And we'll get to NAD in just a little bit. Let's follow pyruvate then. Pyruvate is going to diffuse into the mitochondria, and then we're going to have this pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. And basically what it's going to do is it's going to convert that 3-carbon molecule into acetyl-CoA. This is coenzyme A. So basically now we have a...
Really quick for the record, everybody calls that acetyl-CoA. I don't know what this guy's pronunciation is doing.
2-carbon molecule. That is going to go into the Krebs cycle. Now, since we're going from a 3-carbon pyruvate to a 2-carbon acetyl-CoA, we're giving off carbon. And that carbon is going to be given
What did he call it?
Dioxide. So when you breathe out...
Acetyl coenzyme A, I think it's, I mean, everybody just calls it acetyl-CoA. It's acetyl coenzyme A. It's just, I don't know where he's getting he called it like acetyl, like,
Yeah.
like EAL. Like, I don't know. It's a very weird pronunciation.
Okay.
So a third of that carbon coming out of you is going to come right here from this complex inside the matrix, we call this. I should have said that before. This is the matrix on the inside of the mitochondria. Okay, let's keep watching acetyl-CoA. So it's a 2-carbon molecule. Where does it go next? It goes to the Krebs cycle. And so in the Krebs cycle, we're going to break it down further, and we're going to get rid of these two carbons in acetyl-CoA, and we're going to give those off as carbon dioxide. So we're getting rid of carbon dioxide. What else are we producing in the Krebs cycle? You can see here that we're producing a little bit of ATP, 2 ATP, but we're also adding energy, again, to NAD, and we're adding energy to its friend, we'll call this FAD. And so what do NAD and FAD have? They have these high energy electrons, and they're going to carry those electrons to the third step, which is the electron transport chain. Okay, let's get to the electron transport chain then. All of our energy pretty much that was in glucose is now in NAD and FAD. So they're going to transfer their electrons, and those electrons are going to go through what's called an electron transport chain. Basically, they're moving through a series of proteins, and the energy of those proteins is used to pump protons. Protons are going to be hydrogen ions to the outside of this inner membrane, into what's called the inner membrane space. So now we've built up all of these protons right here. What happens to the electron? The electron is going to be added to other protons and oxygen that we breathe in, and that's going to make our byproduct, which is going to be water. And so let's slow that for just a second. The oxygen that you breathe is moving in here, and it's going to be that last electron acceptor right in here in the matrix, and we're going to take the protons. What happened to those protons? They'll actually flow through a protein called ATP synthase. Those protons will combine with the electrons and the oxygen, and it's going to make water, which is going to be a byproduct of that. Now, how much ATP do we make down here? Well, we can make around 32 or 34 ATP in this last step. And so in the electron transport chain, we're making a whole heck of a lot of energy. And so it's worth taking a look at how that actually works. So let's go to the electron transport chain.
And no, we're not. So, all right. So that obviously is all very complicated, right? Like that video, for those of you who are new to this class, like this is your first day, like that video is probably crazy overwhelming and a lot of information. But you, basically, this is our intro. This is what we are going to spend the next 12 days, like really understanding the entire process of, right? We are breaking down through our digestive system individual molecules that can be used as energy. So then you get a carbohydrate, which gets converted into glucose. Glucose is going to go through glycolysis and produce 2 molecules of ATP and a whole bunch of lactic acid. That lactic acid will get converted into what is called pyruvate, which will ferment and then go through the process of the Krebs cycle, which will spit out 2 more molecules of ATP and a whole bunch of that NAD and FAD. And then NAD and FAD are going to go into the electron transport chain and spit out 32 molecules of ATP. And so that takes a lot of time to kind of study and break down. And that's really kind of what we're introing right now. I don't expect you guys to know this after your first day, because we have whole days dedicated to like understanding these things, where we'll break them down much further. But you can see like this is the process of how we produce enough energy. This is why a good diet, regular exercise, and overall like healthy lifestyle choices are so freaking important. Because like, you know, what makes something like a good food or a bad food is like whether or not it will efficiently produce energy for you, whether or not it has nutrients, right? That's what like good food versus bad food is. But at the same time, we need to understand that even those bad foods that we talk about all the time, like they have the ability to produce energy. They have like, I don't know, merit. They have like, you know, they can still be used to produce ATP and things like that. So looking at a lot of like fad diets on the internet and things like that, who are like, oh, you need to eat this because like it makes you, and they're really vague about like why it's so important and how it makes you healthier. Like the reason they have to be vague is because honestly, it doesn't really track. It doesn't often really actually make sense. This understanding of metabolism allows you to make much more educated choices when we're moving into like our digestive system here in the next class. So that's a really simple breakdown, right? That's a really kind of, I mean, not simple. That's actually a very complicated breakdown. But we are going to simply break this down over the next like 12-day class, the next 2 weeks, right? So glycolysis is a series of enzymatically catalyzed, intimidating sounding, but basically we use enzymes to kick off the chemical reaction, in which glucose is broken down to yield lactic acid, or sometimes called pyruvic acid. That's what those pyruvates are. right? And that'll release some energy as ATP. Some energy is going to get created in glycolysis. Now, this does take place in the cytosol. He called it the cytoplasm. It's the same thing. Cytosol is the fluid itself. Cytoplasm is like if the fluid has stuff in it, which if it's in your cell, obviously it has all the stuff in it. What did I say last? I'm trying to think of the analogy I used to use, and people like loved it. Cytosol is like milk. Cytoplasm is like chocolate milk. There's like a bunch of stuff in the milk, the chocolate milk powder. So both of them are, just fluids, right? And so this is very much an anaerobic process because it's taking place in the fluid portion. There's no oxygen in there. Now, if oxygen becomes present in the right amounts, you're going to end up with aerobic respiration. It's going to transfer into those mitochondria. Now, he mentioned it in the video, but mitochondria are these really interesting little organelles within our cells. They kind of are like a bacteria. And that's the theory in the world right now, is that like mitochondria were kind of their own living organisms. They were their own like little bacteria. And then like an animal cell, just kind of shimmied up near it and ate it. But rather than digest it, it was like, oh man, this thing's really good at producing energy. And it kind of just kept it around. And the mitochondria was like, well, I'm happy to live inside of this protected like cell organism thing. And then like, our cells got more complicated over the centuries, and the mitochondria just kind of stuck around. And so that's kind of what allowed us to get really good at producing energy and allows us to be this big complicated organism. So that, and what's kind of cool is like your mitochondria have their own DNA, which is only replicated in like passed down through like your mother's DNA. So what's kind of cool about that is like if you ever go get like a DNA test, that's one of the ways they are able to track back like where your ancestry is from. They can track all the way back to your mitochondrial DNA and like where you are from in the world, which is kind of fun. And they're able to do that because your mitochondria have like a separate set of DNA that you only get from your mom. So that was a big circle. I said the same thing.
No, I know. But since you said that, it always comes from your mother, like
your mitochondria DNA does, yeah. I mean, obviously you're getting plenty of your DNA and like your blueprint from like your father and stuff. Yeah. But like your mitochondrial DNA, yeah, it can be tracked to your mother's side, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
And then if we want to know why, we've hit my pay grade. The next Y is up over my head. So taking a look at our next bit, right? If we're looking at like aerobic reactions, right? There's two types of aerobic reactions. Once you're done with glycolysis and it passes into the mitochondria, you're going to get another about 36 molecules of ATP, right? Like 2 from the Krebs cycle and like 32 to 34 from the electron transport chain. So what the citric acid cycle is, right? What the Krebs cycle, what it actually is it's a series of like these big enzyme reactions that result in a whole bunch of like acetyl-CoA, which results in a ton of like ATP. Well, a little bit of ATP and a whole bunch of NAD and fat. So I'm going to pull up a Krebs cycle picture here. Look at the Krebs cycle. It is so very complicated. There we go. That's the big one. It's this big wheel, basically. Oh God, why is that such a... Stop doing that. It's this really, really, really big wheel, right? So basically what happens is pyruvate comes in, produces a little bit of acetyl-CoA, and then it goes through all of these, like it's citrate and acetocitrate and ketoglutarate and succinol and succinate, all of these like little freaking things. And then look at all these like little, these big things here. Like look at this, ketoglutarate dehydrogenase. That freaking word is crazy. That is an enzyme. That right there is the chemical name for one of your B vitamins. I could not tell you which one. College me knew, but I have since pushed that information out of my brain. I got video game maps to memorize. No, but no, that is basically each of these.
That's funny.
What's it? Each of these little I could have just said something like responsible, like I got exercises to know how to do. But each of these little tiny things here, these are B vitamins, and each of them are kicking off little bits of NAD and fat. You see that? Like little bits of NAD and fat are being kicked off of here. So what you're left with is a whole bunch of NAD and fat. You're going to spit out a little bit of CO2, right? You're going to exhale some CO2 from this. But now you're going to get 2 more molecules of ATP, like you're left with a little bit of ATP here, right here and here. And you're left with a whole bunch of NAD and fat. And the NAD and fat are now going to go through the last process, which is the electron transport chain. So there's going to be a little bit of like decarbonating, there's a little bit of like oxidation, and a little bit of acetyl-CoA that's going to be formed. And there's the citric acid cycle, right? Boom, 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 boom. It's this big, crazy wheel.
How come? So like on the diagram, why did they call it GTP, like the second one?
So that is actually its own little bit of hold on a second, let me like zoom in on that, right? So yeah, so GDP, right, and GTP, these are also like modified versions of an ATP molecule, which when combined with a little bit of like oxygen, reattach phosphate. They're not necessarily full ATP molecules, they are generating phosphates, but you've got a broken ATP molecule from before, like the last time you did metabolism, right? You had an ATP molecule, you spit off the phosphate, you were left with ADP. Now you're reattaching that phosphate. That's where you're getting it from.
So it like stripped it of oxygen, and then it puts oxygen back, and then it'll make it ATP again.
Really close. Stripped it of water.
Okay.
Stripped it of, yeah, it stripped it of water. So it went through the process of like dehydration synthesis to make this molecule. A little bit of water is going to get exhaled, and then you're left with the phosphate, which reattaches it to ATP. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah.
Cool.
And then
nice job though. I mean, that was close. Like, yeah, it's really close. It's just not. It's part of it is oxygen, but the other parts are a little bit of hydrogen.
Okay. And then one other thing I was wondering was, like, it says that we usually produce like 2 ATP, but then it says like 32 to 36. Is that when we're in a physical state of activity where we're putting strain on the body? Is that what causes the 36 ATP to be created?
No. So you're creating like 36 ATP whenever you go through your aerobic metabolism. You're using trillions of molecules of ATP every day, right? Mm-hmm. So this is happening like constantly, super fast. The 2 molecules of ATP is what you get from the Krebs cycle. The remaining 36, 34, whatever you want to call it. I mean, it can go up to 40 depending on like how crazy efficient you are. The 30-something molecules of ATP you get afterwards are what you get through the electron transport chain. Okay. And so the reason you're seeing like the big number together in aerobic and the small number, like the 2 molecules in anaerobic, is because like 36 is Krebs cycle plus electron transport chain, 2 plus 34.
Okay.
So yeah.
The 34 is mainly coming through the electron transport chain.
Yeah. So it's weird. Like the electron transport chain is actually pretty simple in its own right. Like it's actually pretty easy to understand compared to the Krebs cycle, which is crazy complicated. And the crazy complicated one only results in 2 molecules of ATP, which is the thing we want.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, you're like, good Lord, can we just make some ATP already? And it's like, yeah, now that we've got a whole bunch of byproducts, those byproducts go through the electron transport chain and they create 36 molecules or 34 molecules or
That's
32
crazy.
molecules.
Like
Yeah.
the two are harder to get than the 36 or 34.
Yep. Yeah. How weird is that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
bothered me like forever, but I guess it makes sense if you think of like, it'd be like, it's like a recycling factory, you know? You had to originally make a bottle of plastic, and then that plastic, you know, gets used, and then it does this, and then finally it gets recycled back. But if you're the recycling plant, you're like waiting on that bottle to get returned, you know?
Okay. Huh.
That's not a perfect analogy, but
I get it. I totally get it.
Yeah. All right, so let's go ahead and wrap up. Like I said, I want to make it clear. Normally, I was expecting to get some new folks in the call this morning, but I think we have a lot of evening people joining us. For those of you who are new, we are almost done with today's lecture, and I know this has been like a lot of like brand new terms, and we've been moving really fast. I promise, we're going to continue going over this, and we're going to have whole days dedicated to this. Think of this whole day as like an intro. You ever play board games and your friend just like reads all the rules in a row, and you're like, I can't remember all that, but they still went through all of it in the beginning, and then like as you're playing, they start to mention, you're like, oh, I do remember him saying that. Oh, I do remember that. That's what we're doing today. So last little bit here, the electron transport chain. So high energy electrons, which is the NAD and the FAD, right, contain all this chemical energy from that original glucose molecule. That glucose molecule does not look like glucose at all anymore, right? Now it looks like NAD and FAD. And so these special molecules are going to bring them to this little protein called ATP synthase, or ATPase is what most people call it. And it's this little pump at the end of the electron transport chain. It's this little tiny pump, right? So here's the, oh, I don't like that. I don't like the clear backgrounds. There we go. So you went through the electron transport chain right over here. And then here's all the NAD and FAD. See all these little hydrogen ions, right? All these freaking hydrogen ions here. They're all going to get pumped through this inner membrane space, and then they're going to work their way through this pump right here. Now this pump, what you can't really see is on the inside, it has all these things that squeeze those hydrogen ions together, and that's what results in a whole bunch of ATP being created. So this little protein right here called ATP synthase or ATPase is really where is actually where all of the ATP is being spit out. So all that ATP is being produced by getting squeezed through this right here. That's where you're getting those 32 molecules of ATP, right? Going back over here, actually. So special carrier molecules bring them to the enzymes that store most of the remaining energy. We call that aerobic respiration, and a whole bunch of heat is going to be released. Now, here's the thing, like, there's still like a lot of energy there, and most of it got turned into ATP molecules. So it's like we took energy and we squeezed it into a molecule, and it's like, great, that's very stable, and we can use it to produce energy later. Some of that energy is going to get, just released. Some of it is going to leak, and it's just going to get released as heat. That is why you actually get hot when you exercise. Like your body temperature actually goes up. That's because like ATP can actually sort of start leaking. And so like, well, not ATP, but like energy can start leaking. And so like that results in like ambient heat energy sort of just being released, and it actually heats your body up. This is where like, oh, I didn't know I had a picture coming up. There's ATP synthase. So it goes through these little pumps right here and then works its way through ATPase, resulting in a whole bunch of ATP. So this is why I cannot remember. I think it's D-bol is the name of it. There's a steroid that is a very popular fat-burning steroid, and it's a very effective ATP-producing steroid. What the steroid does is it actually gets your body to produce ATP really, really, really efficiently, and it actually burns, it sort of forces your body to start burning fat as a fuel source. So it's a really popular steroid for fat burning, but it is incredibly dangerous. And I do not recommend, I don't recommend any steroids. You should stay away from those things and avoid them like the plague. But this one in particular is exceptionally dangerous. And there's a really sad story out of Australia where there was like she was like an Instagram model or just a regular fitness model, and she was taking this fat burning steroid, and what was happening was she was burning fat as a fuel source, and that was, that could be okay, but she was still eating a normal diet and having glucose, and she took too much of that steroid. So glucose started getting produced, broken down to produce ATP. But then also we haven't talked about how to do fat. in order to do this, but you can use fat to do this as well. Her body then started burning fat as a fuel source as well. And there was so much production of energy taking place. She felt really great. She had a ton of energy. She was working really hard, but her body could not stop producing energy. And so what started happening was her body got hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. And like her parents like were like, hey, where are you? Like they were calling her and she wasn't picking up her phone. And so they like go to her house and she was literally like in her bathtub with like ice trying to cool her body down. And she like didn't know what was going on. They took her to the hospital. But here's the thing, this is all like in her system already. And it's been mixed with like her metabolism is now producing all this stuff. So she got like hotter and hotter and hotter. And like eventually the doctors were like, hey, like you're going to want to make arrangements. You are going to overheat and eventually your brain's not going to be able to survive. And it was a really sad story, but like she passed away because of this. And it was because of like all that extra energy that does get released. That is, you know, why our temperatures go up when we exercise. That's another reason why it's so important for us to drink water and stay cool during activity. This is why rest periods are important. It's why you want to make sure that you know, always have water available when you're working out, because not only is water really important for hydrolysis, which we've already talked about, it's also really important to make sure that your body doesn't get too hot. So I know it's kind of a weird story to talk about, but that just kind of goes to show you like what energy, I use that story every time to kind of highlight like what energy is, right? It is released as like heat sometimes, but for the most part, our body usually captures that energy in order to do work. So summarizing everything up today, chemical reactions store and use energy in order to maintain what we call homeostasis, like body's balance, right? And to perform all of your essential functions. So you use chemical reactions to do literally everything that you do. Everything you do requires chemical reactions. Major types that we're going to talk about are anabolism and catabolism. Anabolism is the process of building something up. Catabolism is the process of breaking something down. Eating food and digesting it is catabolic. Then taking those ingredients and making new muscle tissue is anabolic. So it's a constant process. This is why, like, when you don't eat after working out, right, you catabolically just broke your muscles down. And so now you want to anabolically build them back up with food. But if you do not eat anything, your body's got to like provide enough energy to kind of keep you moving through the rest of your day. So it might further break down your muscle. That's why it's so important to eat within 45 to 60 minutes after a workout. And then this is all a series of like oxygen reactions. So we call those oxidation reduction reactions. And that occurs when basically you are either losing or gaining oxygen. So the two examples of that are going to be dehydration synthesis, when you are actually pulling water molecules out by removing oxygen and removing hydrogen, or the process of hydrolysis, where you are either adding oxygen and adding hydrogen to split molecules apart. All of that is used in the process of cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is the process of how our cells bring in things like glucose and oxygen to spit out molecules of ATP. In the same way that you need to eat food, which is like glucose, and you need to breathe oxygen in order to like survive, you are respirating, right? Your cells are doing that on a cellular level. They're eating glucose and breathing oxygen to produce ATP. So it's going to start with glycolysis, which is a non-oxygen environment that is used for really intense activity, but we'll get to that later. And then you have the citric acid cycle next, which uses the byproducts of glycolysis to produce ATP. And then the electron transport chain, which uses the byproducts of the citric acid cycle to produce ATP. Now, we didn't talk too much about gluconeogenesis, but I was talking about how we break down fats to produce ATP, we break down glucose to produce ATP. You cannot break down protein to use ATP, but you can turn protein into glucose, and then you can use glucose to produce ATP. That process is called gluconeogenesis. We'll get into that later. And that really is everything we talked about. I still can't do the freaking button to hit your faces. I gotta turn it off screen share. No. Stop screen share. How you guys feeling?
Good. It was a little complicating. I'll probably have to watch a couple of videos, but
Oh, yeah.
I get the basic like cycle of the process, so.
That's what we're aiming for. Honestly, Maggie, we're gonna do it again and again. It's gonna get a lot clearer because we have whole days dedicated to each of the processes. Big things I want you to know about today. Know what hydrolysis is in general, right? Hydrolysis is catabolic, it's to break stuff up. Dehydration synthesis is to build stuff up. That's anabolic. Those are the two key terms.
Right. So adding H2O would be anabolism, and no. Taking away H2O is anabolism, and adding H2O is cannibalism.
Yep. Just like picture your dishes, right?
So you're like overwatering. You're like flooding it to a point where it all separates into
Yep. All right. Let's say you're like me. I mean, Matt, from what I can tell, I think you are much more responsible than I am. But if you've ever made a bowl of oatmeal and left it sitting on your desk for a day or two, I know nothing about that, obviously. What do? You take it to the sink, you put it under there, fill it with water, let it sit for what, 10 minutes? That water starts breaking up all that stuff, and then it comes right off. That's hydrolysis. Hydrolysis broke everything up, so it was really easy to peel it off. Dehydration synthesis is like when you imagine like a dehydrator, right? If you've ever had banana chips, that's all the water sucked out of that, so it's hard and crispy. It's all real stuck together, and it's hard to break apart, right? The reason it's hard to break apart is because the molecules are all holding together really hard. Versus like a regular banana that's really easy to split because there's plenty of water already within it. The molecules are further spaced apart, so it's easy to split. So dehydrated means it's stuck. Wood is really hard, right?
Right.
And that's that. Those are the two key terms. And then we always introduce, the reason the other ones are in there, I don't expect you to understand metabolism yet. It's just we want to mention on the first day because it's here's the stuff we're going to be talking about a lot for the rest of this course. So no anabolic and catabolic. Those are the key. That's the whole day.
Got it. Don't leave your oatmeal bowl out, okay?
Today was I'm not gonna lie, today was Reese's Puffs because I am out of cereal. So that's normally my midnight snack. Today was breakfast. Now I want to make it clear, I am on my, as soon as this call is over and this video starts going, I'm on my way to go make an egg white spinach tomato omelet, real healthy, not Reese's Puffs. The healthy food is coming up. You just don't see it.
Along with the soda, right? No, just kidding.
Oh, no.
I'm just
Stay
kidding.
away from that. Soda's terrible. All right, guys.
I usually never drink soda too, and then this past week I had 4 cactus coolers.
Oh my gosh.
So good though.
I was I don't know what it was.
But it's a childhood thing. I used to drink those when I was a kid, and it brings you back to memories, oh my God, cactus cooler every once in a while. Oh man.
Once
I always get a soda when I go to the movies. That's
Yeah.
when I watch a movie, when I was a kid, my parents would have they'd make themselves cocktails, and they would make me a Coke with ice in it and stuff.
Yeah.
And we would watch movies and eat popcorn. So when I go to the movies, I have to have a thing of popcorn. I have to have a soda.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. Sure.
So, all right, guys, I'm gonna let you go. Everybody who's new, welcome. Hopefully I'll see you guys in the evening class, but if not, we'll see you then.
Did they tell you how many new people we got?
We got 4.
Oh, dang. Cool.
We lost 5, we got 4, so we're down 1. But we got 5 days to add anybody. So there's potential. We could end up with a larger group.
Okay. Is
Frankie.
Jay out of our group now? Is he in the capstone?
Yeah, we lost Jay, Deborah, Vince, Tim,
Kenny.
and
Kenny.
Kenny.
Okay.
Yeah.
Frankie, this is your last mod, or you got one more?